Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, welcome. I'm really glad you're here today. This is just a really rich episode that's full of so much great stuff. I think you're going to love it. Andy Smallman is an educator. He created a nonprofit school that focused on social and emotional curriculum. He currently mentors boys online so that they don't lose their sensitivity. He also has online courses that are available internationally that he teaches kindness and helps kids see the awe and the wonder in the world. He talks about a girlfriend breaking up with him because he wasn't tough enough. We talk about gender fluidity. When he was a teacher, there was a girl who would call him a woman man. And we talk about how our language is so gender biased that we don't have words or we don't think about the tender, sensitive, caring qualities that can occur in men. And again, I'm using binary language, and we talk about this a little bit in the episode, but why can't we have more gender fluidity? And these are just qualities that people have as opposed to being assigned to either men or women. We talk about behavior modification. Andy had a teacher when he was in third grade, and he would watch her pull, especially the boys, by the ear when they didn't do what they needed to do, and how this created some, I don't want to say what it is, I want you to listen, but how this impacted him in a very, very powerful way. And we talk about that many of us as kids would plan, what if there was a fire? What if there was a burglary? How would I escape? How would I get out? And these are things that we often didn't talk about with anybody else. So I'm really curious to know if anybody else has experienced this. We talk about behavior modification, that kids really do the best that they can, and this idea that kids intentionally manipulate, and there's just so much great stuff in here. He also talks about how his daughters have his wife's last name and how they came to this and what they did to make sure that their lineage was included in the names of their children. I just think you're going to love this episode. We talk about so much, and I love the fact that Andy just embraces all of who he is. I don't know, very powerful. Let me tell you a little bit about Andy. For over 25 years, Andy Smallman has been promoting ordinary activities that awaken kindness, helping people connect to their true nature, and increase peace in the world. With our shelter-in-place rules because of COVID, he has been helping people feel less isolated by offering opportunities to connect with others via video chat. Andy is also a visionary educator, being the founding director of the Puget Sound Community School. Andy has brought his pioneering work in SEL, social and emotional learning, online, offering children from all over the world a chance to connect with others. I just think this is a great episode. If you want to know more about me, if you're a new listener, you want to find out where to follow me on social media or my offerings, you can go to my website, unapologeticallysensitive.com. And now, on to the show. Hey, Andy, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
Nice to be here. My editor, Shelley, suggested that I talk to you, but I don't know anything about you, so this will be kind of fun and exciting. I always start out with this question. Do you identify as a highly sensitive person?
Wow. When you told me you were going to ask me that question, and I was thinking like, okay, what's the best way to answer this? I do, but I've not used that term. So, I mean, I could go way back, and maybe we'll do that during the course of the interview. But I've always felt that, I've talked about empathy, but I always have talked about, being sensitive. But I've been insulted by being called that, which I'm sure is fairly common. So when you use the term, it works for me. But if somebody else used it, I might not like it. So,
it's not. I don't think it really accurately describes. Do you want just kind of a quick review of what it entails?
If you want to say so, I think that might be great. I pretty much feel like I understand it, but to hear it directly from you, that's the start of our interview. I'd love that.
I'm going to do this informally. I usually talk about Dr. Elaine Aron's 4 core characteristics, but I think I want to do it differently today. We are deep processors. We have a more active insula. So we will go into a situation and leave and think about it. The negative words are often used, ruminating, but I just think that we process and see things on such a deep level. It also means that we have a strong sense of justice. We want meaning. We really don't do chit chat and small talk very well. We're very empathic, very caring. And then there's this aspect where we notice things that others don't, subtle differences. And some of it is sensory, but some of it is sensitive to maybe the sound of a clock ticking or changes in barometric pressure. But we also notice nonverbal communication. Things like bright lights can bother us. Usually watching violence or being startled is not something that we like. It's how our nervous systems are tuned. We have more active mirror neurons, so we tend to have very high levels of empathy. Because it's sensitive, we often get told that we're too intense, we're too dramatic, we can't take a joke, we need to get thicker skin. But we also come up with solutions to things that other people don't. We're incredibly loyal and conscientious and detail-oriented in our ability to think outside the box and to problem solve. And those, highly sensitive person doesn't encompass any of those things by title. So who would want to be identified as a highly sensitive person? No disrespect to Dr. Aaron.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on your show. That was great. I think you just summed my life up.
Yeah, it can be such a game changer, at least for me, of knowing that there was nothing wrong with me, that this was how I was wired. I attributed the fact that I'm so tuned into other people and what they need and being able to respond as being part of being a highly sensitive person. But it's really due to having a single mom that was incredibly anxious and was just trying to survive. We've done healing work, so this is no diss to my mom. But it wasn't because of that. It's because of how I'm wired. And we have so many strengths, but we often get so much negative feedback about how we show up in the world because it bumps up against other people's discomfort. And so I'm really passionate about people understanding we've just got these amazing strengths, and that I want people to know the gifts that they have, because what comes easily to us, I don't even think that we realize is a gift, because we think everybody's like this.
Again, thank you. Yeah, you're giving me words for things that I've long felt. So yeah, many of the things that you said fit me really, really well. A couple of them less so, but I suspect that's just the case for everybody.
Yeah, yeah. Andy, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? I've read your bio, so people have heard that, but can you just tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll jump into some questions?
Wow. I have to think about where to focus. Well, I guess by profession or training, or even I think by birth, I'm an educator. So I feel like my role in the world has been to make things easier for other people, specifically children. So I really have always referred to myself more as a facilitator than a teacher. I think a teacher does stuff to people, and a facilitator helps people figure things out for themselves. And again, facile, make things easier. So that's really what I've been doing and what I do. And I think I was doing that before I was actually formally trained as an educator. But I've been a certified teacher in Washington State since 1990. And in that time, I've taught elementary school. The big deal that I did was I founded a very unique middle and high school that I ran for 24 years. But outside of that, what I feel like I'm here to do is to promote positivity and kindness. So I do a lot of work around helping people recognize things that would be around wonder and awe, seeing the good in things where it might be harder to see. I feel like that's part of the gift that I have, is that I can find something pretty quickly that might create light in darkness. And so that's kind of who I am and what I do. And I've been lucky enough to make a living at that as well, and raise 2 kids. I'm married. My kids are both, as I say, raised them. They're grown on their own, which is pretty exciting. And so that's a little bit of me really quickly.
I love that. You also did work around social and emotional education, correct?
So that's basically what I say that I did always. I didn't have the terms for that when I started teaching, and that's what I thought was missing in education. And I had it as an instinct or as an inner knowing when I went into education. In fact, when I finished my teacher training, I wrote a paper basically saying why I wasn't going to apply for any teaching jobs. And it really came down, it called it First Do No Harm. I said, teachers need a Hippocratic Oath. And what I was getting at, and I didn't know it quite at the time, was there just wasn't a focus on social and emotional learning. There was this focus on academics, which I felt was problematic and doing great harm to kids. And then I think the research now is showing that kids who really work well and have a focus on social and emotional learning actually do better in other areas, be they academic or whatever else.
Yeah. Well, I have two thoughts. With the work that you're doing in creating wonder and awe, I see that through the lens of being a highly sensitive person, that we notice things that others don't. And my guess is that's part of the gift that you are bringing to people that may not have that awareness of how to look for wonder and awe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a nice way to put it. I don't qualify myself as somehow being better at it than someone else. I feel like it's one of the things that I happen to be focused on. I'm not a painter, for instance, and other people are. And that could be a way that they bring their joy and their sense of self to the world. And mine is to say, hey, did you notice that thing over there? And isn't that phenomenal? And doesn't that make you warm or something along those lines? And if that's not it, then what is it? So
Sure. This is a story that I don't think I've ever shared on the podcast. When I got married, I didn't want to have kids because of the challenges that I had growing up. So I did years of therapy, sat with it for a year, talked to my therapist. When my husband and I bought our house, we didn't think about school districts where we lived, and we moved to a place that doesn't have very good schools. And I'm not a big researcher. Another mother of twins told me about a school called Explorer Elementary in San Diego that has social emotional curriculum. They have a lottery system to get in. It's very, very hard. The only reason she told me about it was they had moved to another part of town, and so she didn't want to get in. That's the only reason why she told me about this school. My kids got in, and by the time they went to middle school and high school, Explorer had come up with an agreement with the high-tech high systems, and all of their schooling was about social emotional learning. And I just feel so grateful. And the work that they did was really about learning how to be kind human people who could express their feelings. And their work was very group oriented. And often their assignments were about summarizing what they had learned in that previous semester to a group of people. So they really came out of it with great skills for being in the world. And I just feel really grateful. There were some shortcomings and adjustments when they went to college. And I'd rather have people that are well socialized in the world than being able to recite history and book learning, but can't manage in an environment.
Yeah, that's similar to the school that I started and ran for 24 years, that every day begins with a big circle of the entire school sharing appreciations, and every day ends with a big circle of the school sharing appreciations, and bringing that to being the focal point of the school. And the same thing that you would say, that if there isn't the first and foremost focus on academics, and you make the first and foremost focus on people feeling safe and secure and loved and respected, and grow from that, you may have some kids that don't have as strong of academic skills when they enter college, but what they do have is the wherewithal to know how to get them. And and that's a big piece that I would try to promote, is if you can help people learn to be kind and decent and of good character, and show them how to figure things out, any point in their life when they need to figure something out, they'll have the confidence and the ability to do it.
Yep. And what I love is both of my boys were diagnosed with ADHD. They were on medication. They both had physical therapy, occupational therapy. One had speech therapy. They had IEPs. I mean, my kids had lots of parenting was very challenging. And what I loved is when they taught them how to write, it was all phonetic, and they did not focus on the grammar. And I was sure that my kids would hate school, would not want to be in school. One of them has dysgraphia, because I had so many somatic issues as a kid. I had stomach aches all the time, and just, because of my anxiety, did not want to go to school. And my boys love school. And I really believe it's because they created a safe environment that I think, had they hammered on the grammar and the technical things, I don't think that they would have thrived as much as they did.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sign of illness in the society or in the school system when kids don't want to go to school. That's a problem. I mean, kids should just be just so excited when school starts up. And that's what we managed, is that the students would say repeatedly, do we have to go on break? When you've got that going on, you're doing something right.
Yeah. And for me, it was that I was so overwhelmed and felt like the world was just too overwhelming that I just didn't want to leave the house. And so I think there are also other reasons, but that's not why we're here today. Can you talk about some of the things that you've experienced as a male educator, and, with this overlay of having this, I would say, sensitivity and awareness at I don't know. I guess I'm curious. In the education world, are there, I'm kind of forming an opinion as I'm talking to you. My guess is that because HSPs tend to be the healers, the educators, the therapists, things like that. My guess is that more of the males that are drawn towards teaching would tend to have the traits of a highly sensitive person. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on that, and then also what your experience was.
Wow, that's an interesting question. And as I formulate a response, I start thinking of that one, and then I go into another direction because there's probably about 10 different directions I can answer that question. So one of the first directions that I'm interested in is that a lot of men aren't pointed towards education because it doesn't pay, right? So that you're told you need to go get a bigger salary. So I think that's one thing. Historically, and this is seen in some ways when I was growing up almost as an insult, that's women's work, so to be interested in being an educator at the age that I am and as I was growing up was seen as kind of a weird thing, right? So I would hear from other people and say, why would you want to do that? That's not going to pay well. And I was try to explain, well, I don't think it's all about the pay. It's about doing what you feel like you're drawn to do. So I do think that supports your perhaps theory that maybe the men that do go into education tend to already maybe self-select, are more empathetic or more highly sensitive. That would work for me. I certainly would say I have no reason to suggest otherwise. So I think there's that. And then it's overcoming some things at different times when you're interested in education. For instance, I got my teaching certificate. When I did this, I was actually postgraduate, and I didn't start college until I was 22 for a lot of the reasons of things that we could probably talk about. Being highly sensitive, school seemed problematic for me. And so when I finally went to get my undergraduate degree, I started at 22 and I finished just after I turned 25. And then I looked into graduate programs and I found this really intriguing program through Pacific Oaks College in Pasadena that had an outreach at the time in the Northwest in the Seattle area. And it was a graduate program where they would take 24 adults college graduates, most of whom were looking to get into teaching as a second career. So many would be in their 40s or 50s. And it was highly competitive to get in. So there'd be like 100 applications for 24 spots. So that was an interesting piece too. But once in it, of the 24, I was one of maybe 4 or 5 men doing that. And that was very common for the things that I was drawn to. As I finished my graduate degree, I was very commonly the only man in these courses. And this would have been in like 1990, 1989, 1991, and the courses would all be about kind of social justice kinds of things and empathy kinds of things. So that kind of interest. So, and the facilitators, the teachers were all basically women as well. So that was interesting. So there was this kind of built-in reinforcement. To be honest with you though, I didn't think about it. It didn't really dawn on me as being that strange, other than I already was strange, is the way that I knew it, is that I liked being alone more than any other man that I knew. I liked figuring out, I liked watching a sad movie or reading a sad book or whatever that seemed weird to like these other buddies of mine. When I ended up in relationships, I had fewer but really intense relationships, and especially romantic relationships growing up too. So that would be more. And I just remember thinking, well, that's just the way I am. But I would be called things, then as well. So, and then going into education, when I was training, when I started doing student teaching, I was in a public school doing one of my student teaching placements, and there was a kindergarten teacher, a woman. And I was telling her about basically my ideas of education, which is really about, and I didn't have the term at the time, I don't know if it existed, social and emotional learning. And she kind of looked at me patronizingly and said, well, we all used to think that, but you'll get over it. And that kind of thing. But that came from a woman kindergarten teacher. And that was really, in some ways, it both was disillusioning and a bit inspiring. Like, well, I'll show you kind of thing. So it served kind of both of those. But then getting into education and having I guess I would refer to it as a softer side, I would seek out places that would be supportive of that. So the first place that I actually was a teacher is a really progressive elementary school outside of Seattle called the Little School. And when I was hired there as a member of the faculty, I never felt odd in that same way. I mean, there were a few men compared to women, but there still were men on faculty who were teaching elementary school. And that was still, I got hired in 1990. That was still unique, but that place, it just seemed, oh yeah, this is where you work. So I kept finding those places. And then, to be honest with you, I created my own. where that could be part of the norm. But I've often had people tell me, wimpy, what you've probably heard all the different terms. I always took it kind of as a badge of courage. I've even had students refer to me as a woman man, at times, like as a compliment.
Yeah.
It was a compliment from these middle school girls who felt like they could relate to me and that I could relate to them. And one of them started referring to me as a woman man.
Which to me shows how much we gender our language and our roles of people, that it's not, we don't even have language around a man who is caring and empathic and attentive and a good listener, that those are, I mean, I'm projecting what I would imagine this girl who called you a woman man is, that's not possible for a man. And so in order for you to be of male gender, that you have to have these female attributes, which is why I just love the idea of having so much more gender fluidity and having these characteristics just across the spectrum without relating them to or prescribing them to gender.
Well, as you say that, I remember going to a teacher training workshop in Tacoma and driving down to this workshop with a co-teacher from the little school, and we went to this, and we were discussing this. The part of the workshop was about gender fluidity, and the idea, and this is 1990, 1991, somewhere in there, so it was pretty progressive for the time, but the whole idea opening my mind that there isn't just men and women, but there's a spectrum, and that was like, wow, does that make sense to me? Mm-hmm. Oh, wow, that was like language for me. Mm-hmm. That, like, when somebody gives you an idea and it opens an entirely new way of thinking, wow. Because I could see myself as being so many things that I grew up and was told these are female traits, right? That you're like a woman. I grew up, I was born in the Midwest in 1963, and growing up in the Midwest in 1963, in the 1960s and 1970s, and then moved to the Northwest when my dad was transferred. I mean, there were some pretty negative terms that people would throw, at a sensitive boy. And sensitive was an insult. Right. It wasn't a compliment.
Right.
It was to be a man or be a boy and be sensitive. I said, oh, he's such a sensitive boy. That was like you go to therapy for that.
Right. I would actually love to hear you name some of the things that you were called, because if you're comfortable, because I know the things that I've heard, but I think the more people hear just a reflection of all the ways that we get kind of put into a box, I think it's helpful to use that to see what is the corresponding strength. So are you comfortable sharing some of the things that you were called?
I can't, to be honest with you, I wouldn't remember all of them, but I can tell you some of them or the spirit of them. They were basically girl terms, right? Like sissy, mm-hmm. which is just, sister, or girly, that terms along those lines. I mean, the worst of them, is pretty big insult now, is like a pussy. Mm-hmm. But all of these are referring back to, being girl-like, as if that's an insult. Right. So that's the kind of thing that I remember. And, if I probably dug deeper, I could maybe come up with some others, but that would be basically the kind of thing. Don't be so sensitive. Why do you feel that? Or you shouldn't feel, there were like people invalidating things that I would experience as, right. Boys don't do that. That's the kind of thing I would hear.
And what a way to create a mental health crisis. And we wonder why we have so many depressed and anxious people, because we are wired to feel things very deeply. And especially for boys that are, I'm so clunky with my language. So if I offend somebody, please shoot me an email and help me out. But for people that are assigned male gender at birth, that do have the trait of being highly sensitive, there's so much shame and no room to be feeling and empathic and caring. And it just is such a disservice. As a female, I also experienced that. And then we shut that down. And then I ended up being incredibly anxious and depressed because I was told that how I was wired and showed up in the world was not okay. So we have to figure out how to disown those parts of us or shut them down to show up the way that we're expected to. And it deprives such a crucial part of who we are. And so unlearning that and going back and doing the feeling work and really embracing that all the feels are okay is so powerful and healing. And the world needs us. The world needs us that are feeling and caring and empathic and want a sense of justice and equity. We need that.
Well, I've been saying recently, really since, if at the risk of going political, since Donald Trump was elected in 2016, I said, hey, we need the women in charge. is that's, to me, what that was hopefully going to awaken, is that we need the women in charge. And just to see the difference. And I know that just makes a binary and says it, but it's really the feminine, if we will, is that what we need to see, I think, in more leadership. Can I tell you a story from my childhood?
Please.
Because it's really related to what you were saying. Yeah. It's a little long-winded, but it really gets at who I am, and I think really tries to illustrate the point that you were making of the disservice we're doing, and I think doing to both boys and girls, identified boys and girls, but really especially to young kids who identify as boys. When I was in third grade, I had a teacher. I was given this teacher who I didn't really know was creating some pretty big challenges for me. She was considered a great teacher. My parents were the co-presidents of the PTA, so they were very involved. This is public school in around 1970 in Omaha, Nebraska. Okay, so whatever stereotypes people want to bring into the Midwest in 1970 probably aren't far off. That this is a school marm who is in charge, and your job is to sit in your desk with your hands folded unless she calls on you. It's kind of the way the school worked, is that kids are to be obedient and respond. Well, again, I'm a sensitive kid, and I want to please the teacher. So anything that would potentially not please the teacher could really cause me stress, like tremendous stress. And so the teacher had a way of wanting to put the children where she wanted them to be. So if we were like lining up for going to recess or whatever we were going to do, and somebody wasn't moving quick enough, she would grab that child by the earlobe and pull them by the earlobe to where they would need to be. And that was my biggest fear, that would happen to me. So I was going to, and I didn't have this as like clear, in the moment. I just knew that wasn't going to be me. And so I always was a step ahead. And again, being sensitive, you could pretty much anticipate when the teacher was going to need you to do something. So I was tuned in and could do that well. And you could also imagine probably that there would be more boys getting pulled by their earlobe than girls. And so now, fast forward to a couple months, 3 months, whatever, into the school year, and my parents now are being honored as lifetime members of the PTA for their volunteer work. And this was going to be an evening celebration at the elementary school. And so at that particular event, my parents didn't know that some of the celebration would involve their 3 sons. I'm the youngest of 3 boys, by the way. Okay, so add that to the dynamic of growing up with 2 older brothers as well. So we were home with a babysitter, but unbeknownst to my parents, we were being brought so we could witness the honor that my parents were about to have. It was a really thoughtful thing, I'm sure. Handed the task of keeping us out of sight until the whatever important moment was my third grade teacher. I'm sure they thought that since I'm the youngest and that I know her and she knows me, she'll be our custodian during that particular time. So now that we're out in the hall outside of the cafeteria / gym / PTA meeting room. And when the time comes, guess how she brought me out in front of the entire audience? And I thought I was doing everything right. But yeah, she grabbed me by the ear in front of everybody and pulled me out. Okay, so there we go. And my brothers, walking on their own, and me, got a little tug on the ear. And the way I remember it is, is like for the entire time. I'm sure it wasn't as bad as that, but still, I was shamed beyond belief. I did not connect this story to the next one I'm going to tell you till I was in my 20s. So the next thing that started happening is I started having night terrors. And it started happening during third grade, in that I would go to bed, and as long as there was someone else awake in the house, adults, I could fall asleep. But if I found that the house was quiet and I didn't hear anyone else, it frightened me. My brother, who's just 15 months older than me, he and I shared a room at the time, and the other brother was across the hall, and he's 3.5 years older than I am. So I started having these night terrors. I would wake up every night and I would break out into a cold sweat because it was quiet. And so I solved that problem by yelling. And when I yelled, people would be awake. My mom would rush in and problem solved. And she'd sit with me, and then I'd fall back asleep. And then the next morning would come, and on we go to the next day. Well, this went on week after week after week after week every night. My brother moved out of the bedroom where we had bunk beds into the basement. My other brother was disturbed by all of this, and my parents started bringing us to a family therapist who was now, so we were doing family therapy and I'm doing individual therapy. My brothers are all over me. This is my problem. Why do they have to go do this kind of thing? So I'm dealing with that. And now the therapist recommends a pretty strict program. He said to my parents, and my dad's a traveling salesman, by the way, so he's gone multiple times a month for extended days at a time. So my mom's trying to deal with this on her own, raising 3 boys, one who's crying, screaming every night. So she's exhausted. So the therapist suggests, and doesn't suggest, but basically mandates that what you need to do as adults is not respond to his cries, because when you respond to his cries, you reinforce it. So it's a logical idea and a horrible practice, especially for
a way to avoid having a secure attachment with your child when they're in distress. Don't respond to them.
Right.
Yeah, that behavior modification, swear word. So
I got all kinds of thoughts around behavior modification, but that's what was basically being used. We also had charts on the refrigerator. I would earn points for nights that I cried less, and then my brothers had these. I mean, it was the charts, the whole bit. We're talking again, early 1970s, so 1970, 1971. This got so bad, though. This is every night. Now we're into 4th grade, and it's continuing. So we're in January of my 4th grade year, and the therapist suggests that I should be observed. So I am admitted, basically I'm institutionalized for a week and told that I can't have communication with my family during this week. This is what they're doing to this poor little boy. And so I was put in the hospital, and I was perfectly physically healthy, right? But I was in what was Children's Hospital in Omaha, and with kids that were really sick, trying to make friends, but I'm out of school for a week. The vivid memory I have is having electrodes attached to my head, and they're trying to figure out, what was going on. And also being told, or at least hearing, that they want to see me have these terrors at night. And then I didn't have them in the hospital. And I even remember thinking as a 4th grader, how dumb are you? I'm in a hospital and there's people awake. There's grown-ups that are awake. And so that didn't yield anything other than I was denied access to my family for a week and had electrodes attached to my head and was institutionalized, right, during this time. So this just continued and went and went. It was my deepest shame. Of all the things that my brothers were, I felt at times unmerciful in terms of how they would tease me about things. But for whatever reason, this one didn't go outside the house. They teased me about my stuffed animals that I had, that I ended up getting a twin bed so I could fit them all in bed with me. They didn't, but I was embarrassed for them to talk about my stuffed animals, who I, of course, talked to, and they talked back to me. And my brothers they might tease a bit about that, but they did not tease about night terrors. They did not tease about me yelling outside of the family. They criticized me and told me to buck up or whatever. But critical thing that I would say is this such deep shame. It wasn't until I was in college. So now, years later, and I'm piecing certain things together, and I could even take this and make it even more incredible. If you're getting tired of this, tell me. But got to college and I wouldn't talk about it. I'm 22, 23 years old because, again, I started college when I was 22, and I still was so shamed by it that I would not talk about it. And now I'm starting to work with kids. I've discovered that's what I'm here to do, is to bring my understanding of childhood trauma to other and bring an understanding voice and respectful voice. And finally, I started going, oh, and I'm sure you understand this language. It's like, oh, that's my superpower. There it is. I don't want anyone to ever have to experience what I experienced, but I wouldn't trade it in now for anything else. All of the pieces of that, because I think it's what unlocked something in me. Maybe maybe that's my way of just accepting the trauma. Maybe it would have been unlocked in a different way, but I look back on that as, oh, I know the feeling of being petrified. And I have even more stories, of what it's like to be 8 years old and be so scared that your body won't move and you can't make a noise, in the middle of the night. So that type of thing. I'll stop there and let you see if you want to ask me anything or tell me if that was useful or not.
Well, it was very useful. There was so much there. And it makes me wonder how many of us as kids had this type of thing happen. It's in some degree. I've shared before that we lived in a neighborhood where there were a lot of break-ins, and my mom didn't like me sleeping in bed with her because I was too restless. So, I already had that message of being too much, no secure attachment. And I would practice breathing under the covers if somebody broke in so that they wouldn't see me breathing. And when I would try and fall asleep and I couldn't fall asleep because I was so anxious, I would count on the clock as each hour progressed how few hours of sleep I would get until the morning came.
Oh my gosh, you're speaking my language here.
And it never even occurred to me to share this with anybody. This was just the life that I lived. And I interviewed Kitty McCormick on the podcast, and we were friends in elementary school. We both ended up being social workers, but we spent 1 year in school together and then drifted apart. And when we reconnected and I started sharing this, she also had similar experiences. And I think many of us experience this. So I'm curious if y'all experience this, shoot me an email, or if you're in the closed Facebook group, Unapologetically Sensitive, maybe I'll create a post if I remember when this comes out, because I have a feeling that this is far more common. And if our parents aren't attuned, they don't even know to ask us about it. And we don't talk about it because it just happens. And it's very distressing. And I'm so disturbed by the way that you were responded to. I mean, I had behavior charts. The whole behavior modification is the implication that the behavior is willful and intentional, and that the child has the ability to control it. And if you just motivate them with rewards or punishments, you can change the behavior. And that goes so against attachment theory and how we want to create a secure attachment.
Well, I can tell you as well that in the daylight, in the doctor's office, I could agree to anything that seemed logical. Yeah, you want me, I can earn points, and the points, the thing that they did, this is funny too, what my rewards turned into were hockey cards, if you want to know the truth, which is a whole nother direction of a story. And during the day, it made perfect sense in some ways to say, sure, I'll do that. And then the middle of the night, didn't make any sense at all. You know, the difference between sitting in a doctor's office with somebody basically telling you what to say and how to say it versus the middle of the night when you're scared and the only reward you want is your mom. It doesn't matter. You could have said, here's $1 million if you don't cry out at night. Why would I want that? I want my mom. I also think, by the way, that my mom is highly sensitive. So in talking to her, she's 87 now, talking to her about this, looking back on it, she was, I think, laying in her bed following doctor's orders because that's what women did, right? My dad's not home. She's laying in bed, probably crying her eyes out by not getting up and going to me because it felt so counter to her. And so there's that trauma that's going on. And it did, by the way, it didn't last. So that didn't last very long, that they didn't, at least the way that I remember. One night was probably too long, but yeah, I don't think my mom could do it.
Yeah. Well, and that was trauma that you experienced. I mean, it was trauma. It's interesting. I have twin boys that are 20 now, and we had a really hard time with bedtime and having them go down. And I went through a period where I was told to let them cry it out. And I remember going to a twins picnic, and it was time to put the boys down. And so I put one of the boys down, and he was crying it out. And it was so hard for me. And I remember another mom couldn't stand it. She went and picked him up. And in retrospect, I did what I thought was right. And what I know now about attachment, I would not do that again. And I honestly believe that kids don't manipulate. It's about unmet needs. Kids do the best that they can. And you talk about in the daylight, it made sense to you because you're in your frontal lobe and you're not activated. And when the trauma or the behavior comes up, kids are not in their frontal lobe where they're rational and calm. There's something else that's going on, and it's usually trauma, fear, something, and that's what we need to address. And it's about attachment, but we get so into wanting to control the behavior. It's such a disservice.
Yeah, I couldn't say that any better. And I love that you're bringing up, so some of the work that I do now, I've been teaching basically social and emotional classes online since the pandemic began through a platform called OutSchool, and have worked with well over 1,000 different kids over the last 9 months. And what parents are finding, parents are seeking out this man that now has developed a reputation, and moms will even write to me, will you work with my child? I don't want him to lose his sensitive side. I'm hearing emails basically only from moms asking, could you help do some of this? But that's one of the things that I try to talk about is helping parents understand that when you are bargaining with your child to do something when they're feeling, normal, if you will, in the frontal lobe, as you said, and then they get into a deeper part of their brain, it's two different situations. I wanted to tell you something else to illustrate. If you post this on your Facebook page or something, I hope people do respond to it. So here's one that I've never told anyone before that is related to what you were saying of the plans that we make as sensitive kids. You're in your bed or whatever, and now you're planning for the fire that when your house is on fire, or you're planning for when the break-in happens or whatever else that you're doing in the middle of the night, right? Because you're scared. And so for me, my plan was how to jump into the fire net, which window from the bedroom, and then how I would jump into it. Now, it was one story up but that doesn't matter when you're a kid, and I'm sure that there was some children's story that I had read that there was like the net that the firefighters would hold, and then you would, jump into it, and how you would jump and how you would land. And so I had that all planned out, that was part of my plan I've never told that story to anybody before. So and that just seems so tiny, so minuscule.
And it's one of the ways that our brains work as far as projecting, troubleshooting, forecasting, that we're so good at anticipating. We're great at, I can't think of the word, that if you're in a business and things can go rotten, you're the person that is really good at protecting things from going bad in a company. Do you know what
I know what you're talking about, because I was the head of school for 24 years and started a school, and part of why I left it was somewhat related to this. So, yeah.
Yeah.
But we also catastrophize sometimes too. So, we have to be a little bit careful, not just to, this is part of what I get into now, is I think I started this for myself, is humans have a negativity bias, right? So we're built to try to notice the things that could harm us. And so I try to counterbalance that. And so I started doing that for myself, of ways to really recognize the importance of bringing positive awareness to things. Because I think, again, I started this for almost therapy for myself, because I would be so good at being able to anticipate, and in many cases, things that wouldn't happen, right? But just the idea of what could happen.
Right.
I also have the challenge of taking on everybody else's burdens, emotional burdens.
What I talk about is embracing the both and I had a guest, Justine Fulker, on early when I started the podcast. And this concept has really shifted how I work with people, that I usually will have two palms up. And on one hand, we really need to honor those fears, those doubts, if it's feelings, the anger, frustration, disappointment, whatever that real stuff is that is about how we're wired. And on the other hand, it's, what do I have control over? What can I do? And really being able to hold the tension between the two. And sometimes for me, like I'm going through some relationship things right now. And so I'm needing to set some boundaries. It's very uncomfortable. It's pushing up against my beliefs of good friends are loyal and don't set boundaries and don't, because the boundary it's a pretty firm boundary. So especially in the shower, I'm having conversations, I'm formulating I'm deeply processing. And if I didn't have the awareness, I would say I was ruminating. And I know that right now, if I use my hands as a scale, I'm much more heavily on the processing and really thinking about how much this has hurt. What do I want? What do I need? And balancing it with, it's really important that I take care of myself, and what do I want to model and what do I need? And so holding the tension between those two, because for me, if we don't honor the pain, the fear, the disappointment, and we just jump to looking at the hope and what's working, that's toxic positivity. And it can be so dishonoring and telling us to just get over it. And so being able to hold the tension between those two, to me, is very, very important.
Yeah, that's really well said. I try to get across to people that we're not trying to ignore that there are negative and challenging things. Pandemic is awful. Okay, there's a lot of horrible things about that. I don't want to deny any of that. There's also opportunity in it. And so that's where I try to say, look for what you have. What we tend to end up doing, and this is if you want to get down to some of my philosophy in a very simple statement, is I think we tend to focus on what we don't have. I think that we're trained to do that. I think our educational system actually teaches us to do that, is to focus on what we don't have. I think that if people could take a step back from that and also see what they do have, they can make a big world of difference, and they will bring a more positive outlook and more optimism to every situation rather than making things worse. Well, I can't go see my parents, or I can't go do this, or I can't do that. Well, keep reinforcing that message. But what can you do? What are you able to do now? Well, you're spending more time with your kids, or you're able to connect more with your partner at home, or you're making healthy recipes that you didn't have. I mean, just try to find some of those, but don't take away from the fact of what we can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Can you tell me about a time when you had a girlfriend that broke up with you because you weren't tough enough?
Oh, yeah, I guess so. I mean, which one do you want? So the story is basically this. So when I was 19, I'm trying to think of where to start this story, to be really honest. And this is a wonderful human being who I still know to a certain extent now. But this was my first serious girlfriend, like post high school. 19 when we started dating, and she's 20, so a year older than I am. So at the time, we spent a lot of time together over the course of the summer and then into the fall, and we kind of moved through the winter and spring. She's in college and out of state during this time. And she came back to visit and in essence broke up with me. And I mean, the one thing is to call that it's a simplistic explanation, but one of the explanations that she gave me was I just wasn't really tough enough. Now, that may not have been her language, but it's certainly the way I interpreted what she meant. And what she said is I wasn't manly enough, and that she had found somebody else that, made her feel more whatever. And I saw that both as it wasn't as big of an insult as I think it might have been accepted by somebody else at the way that I took that moment, which was part of a bigger kind of unfolding. But it was very clear to me that in some ways she wanted to feel protected in a way that I didn't bring to the relationship because I believed in equality in a relationship. I also, here's another example of where I one of the things that drives me absolutely bananas are those jewelry ads that the woman is just surprised by the man buying the really expensive jewelry. It's always a man who's buying it for the wife, right? And she's so touched by that. And I think that is a horrible message to give to children, that's the role, because that's this ongoing idea that the man is the one who controls the money. With my wife, who here's related to this in some way, to make this sounds like I can't even figure out how to phrase it. She kept her name, right? Like, why wouldn't she? I kept my name too, right? So her last name is different than mine. So we don't say, well, the man kept his name, but we do say the woman kept her name, right? So, well, if she kept her name, so did I. So that's to me a sign of you're in an equal relationship and not one that you just default and take the man's name in it. Again, we're talking heterosexual marriage in this particular case, right? And so what do you do when you have children? Okay, now that becomes the big wild card. And we got married in 1990. We had our first child in 1993. And our older daughter, we have two daughters, Chloe and Ella. And so we started doing some research, pre-internet research around this, and went to the library. And we found this book that talked about, it was really about genealogy, that we lose the women's line if we go through history because the women take the man's last name. And we didn't want to do that. What if we have a girl? We didn't know if we were going to have boys or girls. And so we came up with this idea based on what came out of there was, well, if we have a girl, and again, how do you know, this is all based on how they appear at birth, right? What their parts are at birth. So we're still in that mindset in 1993. But if we have a girl, we've decided that the girl will have Melinda's, my wife's name, will have Melinda's last name. And we will give them my last name as their middle name. So that's what we did. So Chloe is born in 1993. She is Chloe, middle name Smallman, last name Shaw. And had we had a boy, we would have reversed it. And so that would be, whatever the boy's name would have been, Shaw Smallman. And the research shows that if everybody does that, then you don't lose a line. You follow that through. And it's, I think, Scandinavian, is where a lot of that comes from. So now the thought being is, okay, now you're going to have a second child. What if you have a boy at that point? And now they're going to have different last names. And the answer we gave people was, yes, that would be what would happen. But we had a girl, so we have Ella Smallman Shaw as well. Now, here's where the kicker comes when you're a man and your kids don't have your last name. Guess what everybody assumes?
That you're the stepfather.
Exactly. And at the border, in questions like that, it takes some extra explaining. So that's part of what I've done a lot in my life, is some extra explaining. But this all started because you were asking me about that first girlfriend who basically said I wasn't tough enough. So when I was 23, I started working with a severely autistic 18-year-old. It was part of my undergraduate work that I got hired by the Shelton School District. Shelton is south of Seattle, south of Olympia. Anyway, so small town. And this 18-year-old autistic young man had been basically abused by the school district, and they were paying to have him do this home program, and I was hired to be involved in it. So the mom of this boy, who a lot of autistic kids are extraordinarily sensitive, right? They tune into things like, that's part of autism in lots of ways. But I remember talking to her about these things, and she would ask me, she saw me as being very unique as a 23-year-old young man. And said, don't worry, Andy, the women, when I told her the story about this being broken up with at 19 and then having that happen again in college. I had another woman in college who broke up with me, and it was a very similar kind of story. And I don't think I ever broke up with anybody. When my relationships ended, I was crushed, and it was people breaking up with me. And I could not also, by the way, here we'll get into the adult portion of the program. I also could not have one-night stands. I just couldn't do it. That, to me, a sexual relationship with somebody was like a commitment. And so I wouldn't want to be involved until that. So that's another little factor of being a sensitive young man, and makes you weird, right? Makes you weird. So anyway, the mom of this autistic young man told me, "Don't worry, Andy, the women will catch up with you someday." And I love that. I don't know if it's happened yet, but it was such an affirming thing that sticks with me, 35 years later, that I had this support from this middle-aged mom. So I don't know. Did I answer your question well enough?
You did. There's so much that I want to unpack, and I'm looking at time. And so I just want to name what we're not going to address, because I just don't want it to go unnamed. I think there's so much there about feminism and how women are conditioned from a very young age, and boys too, boys and girls, that we're supposed to find a strong man that's going to protect us and save us and heal us. And there's not this sense of efficacy and competency on the part of both genders, if we're just going to talk in a binary fashion, which again is not even fair to do.
I agree.
I mean, just the whole problem with gender stereotypes, and that we all can't be strong and sensitive and brave and frightened, and all of those things are okay, and that we can come together and have equal relationships. I mean, there's just so much there. And I think the Hispanic culture, the women tend to have very long names because they take on, I believe it's their mother's name, so that they tend to have very long surnames. Do you know about that?
It sounds familiar enough to me. I do know that there are people who have extremely long names. Yeah.
Yeah. So this just comes down to me to the challenges that we have with the patriarchy, and that our society and culture was set up by white men who want to maintain power, and it really ends up creating challenges. And there's so much more around gender and gender fluidity that really should be coming into this conversation. And I just want to acknowledge that. And two things I want to circle back to. I'm on TikTok and I love it. And what I'm loving, and again, I'm going to be clunky with my language, so please be gentle with me. I'm seeing men, and I don't know if they're non-binary. I don't think that they're trans. I don't know how they identify as far as their sexual orientation, but really starting to enjoy nail polish and makeup and wearing skirts and dresses and showing themselves. And I'm not one that wears dresses very much, but there's a really nice flowy feeling of having fabric against your legs and watching them enjoy this exploration. And I'm loving it. I'm really hoping that we can move much more towards a gender fluid society, that we're not so binary in how we ascribe pretty much everything. I feel like I'm not able to speak super articulately about it, but I was thinking about that earlier when you were talking about something.
Well, that makes me think of a couple of things. May I jump in, or
Please.
did you get to finish?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the two things. One, I had a lesson once as an undergraduate, and I forget exactly how I got it, maybe a professor or somebody, saying that all big progress comes right after a backward slide. Is that we make some steps, we get scared by those steps that we've made, and then we go back. And that's how I saw the Trump election, is like, okay, that's a backward slide. But that was a pretty significant one. And it's easy for me to identify that. I am a white man, identify heterosexual. I'm an American. I got every privilege. A friend of mine once described it as, oh, yeah, we won the privilege lottery, right? So there's a lot of things that I can just disguise myself or just fall right in and not have to think about. And I had that first awareness without any of those terms when I went for a walk at like 10 o'clock at night once. And I do this really regularly. And I asked like this woman friend of mine, if she ever did something. And I said, why in the world? No, I'm not allowed to do that. I mean, there's so many like wake-up calls I've had at different times in my life about what I could do that I just took for granted. So that was one piece, is that I think that now perhaps we're ready for the next growth step. That's my optimistic way of what's coming next. So that was one thing. And then the story that I had is when I was in high school, I was a bowler. I guess I still am. I don't do it very often. I love to bowl. And so I was on the high school bowling team, which also was a source of being teased. You didn't actually get a letter if you were on the high school bowling team. And so, there are all kinds of, but it was associated with the school and all that. It was just a fun way to connect with other people and get to bowl occasionally. The coach was not one of the faculty members, which would be unlike most other sports. So this was a recruit from the parenting community, and we'd go to the local bowling alley. Well, I made the team in 10th and 11th grade and was in the middle of trying out in 12th grade, which you'd think is a pretty much a no-brainer at that point that you're going to make the team. And I bowled really well. I was averaging like 170 or something during the tryouts. Also, at the same time of the tryouts, there was a party on some Friday night. It's high school, it's senior year, and I'm at this party. But before going, I had a good friend of mine, this girlfriend, not girlfriend, but girlfriend. And we were over at her place. She was into David Bowie, and her older brother was into David Bowie and really kind of the Ziggy stage. And they were putting makeup on. And they said, "Hey, Andy, you want some makeup on for the price?" Sure, why not? Let's have some fun. And so I was made up. I liked a thrift shop at the time. I had these tight black pants and what would be a black and white, I called it a disco shirt, at the time, and a pink vest. So now I've got rouge and mascara and lipstick, and I've got these tight black pants and this black and white disco shirt and a pink vest over the top of it. And we show up at the party, and the party is at the coach's house. So the kid is also trying out for the team, a year younger. Interestingly enough, I got cut that week from the bowling team. So I have long equated those two stories. So anyway,
all I can think of is homophobia.
Yeah,
it just enrages me.
And I was aware at the time that the connection. I was like, whatever.
Yeah.
What do you do with that when you're 17 years old?
I'm really impressed by your resilience. I'm feeling torn because we really do need to wrap up. But through all of your stories, you just have this. I see this thread of resilience and things that were trauma and really could have been very detrimental, that you just really are resilient and came through it in just such a beautiful way. So I'm very impressed.
Oh, that's nice of you to say. I'm 57, so there's some experience and reflection that you try to grow from. I had enough challenges at different times. I also think that I was, in some ways, the third, son. Like, okay, what are we going to do with him? I think sometimes was what was going on. And I don't think my parents necessarily would maybe put it that way now, but I do think it was, okay, this is different.
Yeah. Andy, tell people a little bit about OutSchool, where they can find you, what you have going on.
Thanks for that. So what I do now is I really tell people I work as a mentor or as a consultant or, again, as a facilitator. I work to try to make things easier for people. And I really want to do it over two areas. I say I want people to feel connection and warmth. So things that I do is really around connection and warmth. So you can find me at andysmallman.com. In terms of OutSchool, I learned of OutSchool a year ago this month that it is an online platform basically to match children, families, with teachers. And so I posted a kindness class there because I have an international reputation for promoting kindness. And somebody said, I think you did the first ever online kindness class. So that's where I started. But it wasn't until I offered social skills classes for 7 to 10-year-olds that things started to really grow. And so from that, I do compassion-based classes and positivity classes and kindness classes. And I do all that on OutSchool, and I fill my week doing that. I also meet with individual clients. I mean, this is all happening on Zoom, and that can be youth and adults, parenting coaching. I offer other kinds of services as well. I like to tell people this story that I'm a wedding officiant. And so my sister-in-law, my wife's sister, and her husband asked if I would perform their ceremony back in 1998. So after I had done that at the reception, I told my father-in-law, first I married your oldest daughter, then I married your youngest daughter. And he thought that was the greatest line ever. So for the rest of his life, that's how he would introduce me. So I do things like that. But in anything and everything I do, I just want people to feel they're okay, that there is a guide inside them that they can get access to. They had it when they were younger, and I feel like I have a way to help them feel good about themselves. So however I can do that, I'm happy to do it.
I love that. And I will have information in the show notes at unapologeticallysensitive.com. If you go to my website, to the podcast page, and just click on Andy's episode, all that will be in the show notes also. Andy, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you have a burning desire to share about before we wrap up?
Can I tell one thing? Is that what this is for at this point?
Sure.
All right. So that first woman who broke up with me, the one who said I wasn't tough enough, all right, she also was the one who recommended the Big Brother program for me when I was 21. That at 21 years old, I had a job. I was doing okay, but I felt unfulfilled. And she said, "You're good with kids. Why don't you look into that?" And I looked into that and was matched with a third grade boy. All right. So there's that third grade thing again. And it changed my life. It was the moment that I went, oh, I'm supposed to work with kids. And that's why I went to college. And I went to college with the focused goal I was going to become a third grade teacher. Guess what? That's where my trauma began. Very profoundly. The third grade boys who I was matched with as a big brother, little brother, we were named actually the match of the year and got to hang out with the Seattle mayor once. And then the third thing was I'm now focused to become a third grade teacher. I did not connect those dots for years.
Interesting. I meant to circle back to this. When your teacher walked you out on stage by your ear or pulled you out on stage, do you attribute that to the trauma that caused the night terrors?
I do now. I think that was like if you needed the deciding factor, but I think I was so traumatized by how she ran her class and being so sensitive and didn't know how to connect those things. I didn't, and this is me making sense of it as an adult. So that's all I can tell you is that's what makes sense to me and started making sense to me in my 20s. So now we're talking 30 some years ago. But that's like the if you needed to push over the ledge, that'd be the one.
Yeah, I was just talking with Sarah Bueno, who's been a guest a few times. We have a Marco Polo relationship, and I went through something that it seems like it activated some trauma that wasn't my trauma. And when we were talking about it, she used a term called field trauma. And it almost makes me wonder if, you were observing trauma in the classroom. It wasn't directly your trauma, but field trauma. And then having that direct experience. I'm not a trauma expert, so nobody quote me on this. I'm just talking. But if that wasn't part of what happened, because what I was sharing with her is that I witnessed something happen. Everything was fine, but that in itself was traumatizing because it showed me what could happen to me in this situation that I was doing by myself. But it also felt like it activated a trauma that wasn't mine. And as we were talking about it, so I think that this witnessing of something that happened activated some field trauma for me. So I'm just kind of curious if that was the same process.
That resonates for me. I mean, that's one experience, but I can tell you other experiences of being motivated by the fear of not wanting to get in trouble in school.
Yeah.
And other things.
And how many times we as highly sensitive people, I'll be talking to somebody and they'll be talking about something that somebody else did to them. And I'm wondering, do I do that same thing? That real inability to know, like, I don't show up that way, but often that sense of, am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong? I think that's more about a trauma history than the trait of being a highly sensitive person. There is a delineation there and I'm not always able to delineate where it is, but yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Andy, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really glad we got a chance to chat.
It's been great. And where do I pay the therapy bill?
Just listen to the podcast over and over.
Fair enough.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye. Hey again. I'm curious to know, what did you think? How much of that resonated with you? I always wonder where people are when I talk about things like gender fluidity. And this year, after seeing so much of the inequity that we have in our world, it's really helped to increase my awareness. And I'm always wondering how that lands with people and how, I was going to say progressive, but I don't want to sound judgmental. It just makes me wonder where people are at and if that's interesting, if you support it, if it's new, if it's uncomfortable. Just always curious about that. I feel pretty committed to really wanting to work on and bring attention to how much inequity there is in so many areas. And it's what I've been doing all along. It's just broadening the scope. So I'm just curious about that. This last week, we held the second week of the online Hsp course. And I just wanted to share with you a couple of things that people said. I started out by just asking, how are you feeling about coming back to group? If you don't know, I teach an online course for HSPs. It's a 10-week course. You can go to my website, unapologeticallysensitive.com, and go to the HSP groups page. We cover things like boundaries, perfectionism, turning negative messages into your superpower, mindfulness, self-compassion, identifying negative messages and turning them into superpowers, perfectionism, embracing our emotions, self-care is non-negotiable, boundaries, communication, authenticity, vulnerability, and creating a lifestyle that honors the HSP. And we also talk about expectations and disappointments. When we met this last week, what people had shared was they were feeling less anxious. They were able to unplug more. They felt more present. They were excited. They really wanted to listen. They were feeling like they were more present in their body. And we do a grounding exercise, and people said that they really appreciated that slowdown and just connecting to what's going on and being given permission to show up exactly as they are and to not try and be like they are the other times in the world when we try and fit in with the other 80%. Because in this group, it's really about you need to turn off your video, if you need to walk away, if you need to have a snack, if you don't want to share. This really is about creating a safe space where you can show up and be exactly how you are. And I can't tell you how much that wound of being too much shows up almost every week. People feel like they're taking up too much time, that they're taking too much attention, and how everybody says how much they benefit out of hearing that person share and how normalizing and validating it is. I just think these groups are incredibly powerful. The next round of courses will launch the week of April 2021. If you're interested, they've just been transformational. Anyways, I hope you are doing well. My hope is that by the time you hear this, we're recording in January, that things are starting to settle down. There's a little bit more predictability, a little bit more peace, a little bit more joy. I just really care about each and every one of you. Thank you to all of you that are reaching out to me, telling me how much you appreciate the podcast, how much you've been impacted. It really means the world to me. My hope with this podcast really is that people know that you are not alone, that there's nothing wrong with you, that we have amazing strengths and gifts to offer the world. And if we've got wounding or trauma, we can work through that to really appreciate the trait of being highly sensitive. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.